Hey guys, what's good today? It's another amazing cybersecurity training with FIXITGEARWARE-SECURITY. And today we come with another amazing topic, or should we say subject matter when it comes to cybersecurity. So for this week, we decided to integrate our blue teaming training as part of our cybersecurity content we'll be publishing for free on our official YouTube, which is the FIXITGEARWARE YouTube channel. And it's quite interesting because this is something that we have looked into to put as part of our content, especially when it comes to training and giving free content and information on how to get started with cybersecurity. And if you look out there, it's quite saturated with a lot of red teaming training and content. And not just that, it's also something that makes the blue teaming labs, or should we say the blue teaming training, to be some sort of lucrative stuff where organizations are creating blue teaming related content and charging exorbitant fees to provide this training. So after taking a deep dive and understanding and looking at the landscape in terms of the economy, we decided to integrate the blue teaming section into our trainings. So just for you to know, we've been doing some sort of blue teaming stuff, but basically those are like installing tools. And if you want to see those videos, you can scroll through our blue teaming category to see those contents. But like we said, we started thinking about things we can do to like support the industry. And of course, considering the fact that newbies might be getting started in the profession and not have the financial resources to pay for those labs, and that hurts us a lot, that we're thinking much about it, and we decided to like put on something which at least in a way gonna serve as a way of making things easier for them, and ensuring that they can be able to practice and have skills to showcase when it comes to seeking for jobs. And most importantly, we are very passionate to ensure that most of you by the beginning of next year will be able to have a job or secure a good job positions. And this can only be achieved by putting things together for you to have as hands-on experience. Okay, and this hands-on experience, you can showcase them as part of the knowledge you have aside your soft skills when it comes to these various job interviews you have to go to, or should we say attend, in order for you to secure this job. So what you're going to learn with us on our blue teaming training is not just tools. We'll be talking about various subject matters in blue teaming for the free content we're going to publish. And if we want to move on to a more enhanced and dedicated content, that is also going to come in our courses. And trust us, whatever we're going to teach you is something that comes from the heart. Okay, we're not giving you information because we want to showcase that we have skills, but we're giving you information because we want you to have skills. Okay, and you having skills is something that is good, not just for you, but also for us, because if you're very kind enough, from what you learn from us, you'll be able to tell others where they have to get started in terms of learning a lot of things when it comes to cybersecurity. So this is just a brief introduction, not an in-depth introduction of what the blue teaming labs is going to be all about. But from time to time, expect that we're going to have some jargons. We're going to be talking about these labs and what it's all about. And those jargons are things that are going to, be more focused on everything centered on blue teaming, not just various job roles. Okay. So if you're yet to subscribe, ensure you hit that subscribe button, and of course, turn on notifications, because things are about to get, very much interesting with us. And when we mean interesting, we mean in depth. Okay. Not just on a surface level, both on our free content and of course on our training, paid enhanced courses. So with that being said, let's get started. So today we're going to talk about installing Keybanner and ELK, which is known as Elastic Logstash and Keybanner, which is part of a tool you have to know very well when it comes to the job role of a SOC analyst, okay, which is Security Operations Center Analyst. So this job role is quite elaborate, or should we say quite a vast field, because you have to have an in-depth knowledge on various subject matters such as threat capturing and analysis, malware analysis, and a whole lot of things you have to know when it comes to the job role of a SOC analyst. And why you should get started with the job role of a SOC analyst is that we're talking about the new wave of artificial intelligence, which is also known as AI. And a whole lot of people are starting to adopt this, this strategy of using AI to, make their job role faster in terms of integrating AI to their various platforms. So while this is also a good benefit, it's also an indication that there will be a high rise of cybersecurity breaches or attempts to breach in the future. And when we mean the future, in a few years or even in a few months, because AI is the new thing and it has been widely, integrated on various business enterprise. So you should know about this because this is part of what the SOC analyst will be dealing with every day. And when we talk about security operations center, it's not just for those who are working in the railway station. Okay, I know you probably have that knowledge that, oh, you work in a railway station, that's where the SOC analysts will be working. No, it's part of the role, but big corporations, industrial control systems, Fortune 500s, and a whole lot of big infrastructures or firms have a dedicated SOC centers where they investigate, monitor, everything that comes in and goes out of the organization. So this involves them integrating lots of concept and tooling, which involves the CM tools and so on, and other tools as the endpoint detection and response tools, which we also known as the EDR. So the job role of a SOC analyst is quite vast, and you have to expose yourself in the practical aspect of it. Okay, unlike certain professions of the blue teaming, the role of a SOC analyst is not something you read on books. Okay, it's hands-on. You have to be pragmatic about it, or should we say you have to be practical about it. And this is where you need to have your own personal labs, simulate your own labs, try to learn how these various tools you will be using, or which most organizations use in their infrastructure, that is for those who want to seek the role of a SOC analyst, are using and how they work. So how do you now get these tools? Well, we know most organizations or platforms or learning platforms have, paid subscriptions where you have to subscribe for their labs. And these labs are actually something you have to be subscribing every month to get hands-on. And getting hands-on with those labs is also not a good fit. Now, I'll tell you the caveat why we do not do our labs right now is that, let's just take, for example, let's say Hack the Box or Try Hack Me or any other good labs out there, have their labs. Please don't get a wrong notion. It's not talking down on their business, but we're just being realistic. Everybody practices the same thing on those labs. Okay. So it's like if we have 10,000 subscribers on those platforms, the knowledge you're going to have is the same knowledge the 10,000 subscribers are going to have, because it's the same solutions, it's the same payloads, it's the same concept you have to use to solve those labs. Now, let's say those 10,000 have successfully solved those labs and they are seeking for jobs. Now, imagine everybody having the same concept, the same ideas, not thinking outside the box. So it becomes a competition, right? This is now where those who have more advanced technical skills by researching or practicing other things that are not related to those labs would now, scale through to get that job role, or should we say that position which they're applying for. So today we decided to teach you on how you can install, or should we say get your own ELK machine running. And this is done via Docker, which is a container application or containerization to ensure that you can always pull, take down, stop, and not just having these softwares running on your machines locally and consuming lots of resources. So by the time we're done today, you're going to learn a whole lot of things on how it runs. And don't worry, most of these softwares, their documentations are not precise, or should we say are not clear part on how to use them. So we decided to work on things in a very sequential manner on how you should understand these installations and how you can use them effectively on your own to practice your various related blue teaming concept when it comes to the job role of a SOC analyst. So before we get started, I want you to understand that you need two things to be running on your machine. Okay, first you have to install the WSL, which is the Windows subsystem for Linux. This is to ensure that your system is able to run Linux-based commands and spawn Linux-based PowerShell. Then secondly, you have to install Docker, because Docker is basically a containerization platform where you learn how to pull containers, create YAML files, and of course use those YAML files to spawn containers that are out there that are related to whatever training, or should we say concept you want to learn when it comes to using containerization platform or related instances. So remember, once again, you have to run or install WSL and of course install what we call containerization, which is known as Docker. Don't worry if you don't know how to install it. We set something related to that on one of our expos, but don't worry. On our next week, on our first week cybersecurity training, we intend to walk you through on how to install WSL on your machine, and of course on how to install Docker container on your Windows machine. Okay. And by the time we're done, it's a very easy way to install, but we're going to walk you through it so that you understand what you're doing and not make mistakes during the installation process. Okay. So beyond all that, subscribe, turn on notification bells, and of course, let's head on to installing ELK and Kibana on our Docker instance or containerization application running on our system. So to get started, we have to run Docker. Be mindful, this might take some time because Docker engine is quite a heavy instance. It's going to try to, sync properly and run everything that is on our system. Okay, so now we are here. Okay, the next thing I want you to do is be mindful of these various steps. Okay, it's a very easy steps and straightforward. First, you click on terminal. Okay, we have our various PowerShells we have on our system, but this specific PowerShell is what we use. Okay, so first we want to create a directory where we want to run our ELK and Kibana, our Elasticsearch and Kibana. Okay, so you can do it in two ways. You can create it under the user's profile, or you can create it in the local C drive. For us, we prefer creating it in the C drive because it makes it easy for us to move the folder to out of our C drive and put it back if we need to, okay, and to create more spaces on our system. Okay, so I would advise you to follow this step. Install on your C drive, and there, if you don't have memory space on your PC, you can just cut the folder and store it on an external drive, and whenever you want to work on the Docker stuff again, you copy it back and put it on the C drive location and access it through the PowerShell once again. Okay, so we do this way. We say cd, okay, we say c, and we put a /. Okay, now we're in our C drive. The next thing we want to do is that we want to create a directory. Okay, you can call it any directory. You can call it ELK. You can call it whatever name you want. But for the sake of this training and for the sake of organization, let's say the word perfection, you have to name this directory in a very, simple manner where you can be able to remember what the directory is all about. Okay, so in this case, we want to call this directory Elasticsearch and Kibana, right? So we can say mkdir and we say ELK, and we hit enter. Now we have created the Elasticsearch directory. Okay, the next thing we want to do is that we want to ensure that we run this container in the appropriate directory and not mess up our entire system. Why? Because if you don't run it properly, you might have instances where you're running, you want to spawn, like let's say you have multiple containers. In our case, we have multiple containers that we usually run, and we kept them off for some reasons. And these containers are essential that we use them for our day-to-day activities. Okay, so that's the reason why you have to ensure that you install these various containerization platforms which you're going to be working with on the specific directory you have created. So now let's move into the into the ELK directory which we have created. We'll say cd to the ELK, and we hit enter. Good. Now, if we ls, you can see there are no files inside. Okay, as you can see, there are no files inside, right? Now we're done. The next thing we want to do is that we want to run the Kibana, okay? And of course, the current Kibana version we are going to use, which is stable, is the 8.9.0, okay? So how do we now run this in this directory? It's very simple. We'll say docker, okay? We'll say run minus the detach, okay? Hyphen name, okay? Then we say Kibana. Okay, specify the port number to run on 5601. Okay, colon 5601. Sorry about that. We made a mistake. 5601 colon 5601. Then we say docker. As you can see, it's populated for us, right? Because we've done this installation previously. So we can say enter. Now, you can see now this has run Kibana. Now, why this run Kibana is because previously we have the volumes here. Let me show you something. Wait, containers. Okay, previously we had the container here. Okay, we did not, delete it. And if we go under images, you can see that we have Docker and Elasticsearch, right? Which is not good. So now let's stop it. We can say Docker stop Kibana. Good. So we can say Docker remove Kibana. Good. Now we need to delete this too. It's very important that we delete this. Yes, forever. It's good that we are walking you through this process so you can understand what we are doing. So now you can see we do not have Kibana. Here we do not have Kibana. We do not have Kibana. Okay, you can see we do not have Kibana, right? So we start afresh. We say Docker run. Okay, then we hit enter. Now you can see it tells us that it was unable to find Kibana. Now it's trying to pull the container for us and install the instance afresh. Okay, now the reason why we did this is for you to see the steps of what we did, so that it can be very clear to you that whatever concept we are using is a very straightforward concept, okay? And consider it as a learning path for you to understand how containerization works in terms of images, volumes, and containers, okay? This is not a full training on Docker, but we decided to use this concept to show you on how this runs, especially when you delete a container. It doesn't mean the volumes are away. You have to, delete the volumes, delete the container, and of course the sequential manner is to stop the container from running first before you delete those files. Okay, if not, if you try to delete them, it's going to tell you that something is using these containers or the volumes are running and you cannot delete these files. Okay, now one more thing you should also know: once this pulls the container for Kibana, it is going to spawn Kibana to be active. Okay, and Kibana requires Elasticsearch to work perfectly fine. So once this pulling is completed, the next thing we have to do is that we have to stop Kibana, and stopping Kibana makes us to be able to run Elasticsearch. Then after we have run Elasticsearch, we also have to stop Elasticsearch and of course do a few network configuration files whereby we have to sync Kibana and Elasticsearch to work together. Okay, so we're just sharing these ideas with you so that you can understand the next step of what we are doing. While this might not really be something that lots of technical stuff will show you, but it's very important that you have this knowledge, because the pragmatic aspect of our training is not about telling you how things are, but how they work. Okay. If we don't walk you through the steps, you might go out there and, claim you know how to run this container, how to do this to what's it called? The technical team that is going to interview you. And by the time they listen to you or see how you act or what you do, it will not be a sign that you don't have knowledge of what you're doing. You're just guessworking, or should we say just doing some random stuff. Okay. Now, as you can see, our Kibana is completely installed. Now, to show you that this is running, we can say Docker. We can say PS. Okay. And we hit enter. You can see right now Kibana is active, which is running. Okay. And we don't want this to happen so that it doesn't conflict with installation of ELK, it doesn't conflict with the installation of Elasticsearch. Okay. And if we go to images, you can see we have Kibana already running. Okay. And if we go to containers, you can see that Kibana is active. You can see the healthy sign, which is the green sign. Okay. That's a sign that it's running. Okay. So do not stop it from here, because everything we're doing is a command-based, concept. So we do clear screen. Then the next thing we want to do is we say Docker stop Kibana. Okay. Now, to be sure that Kibana is successfully stopped, we can say Docker PS. And you can see there is no container running, which means Kibana is stopped. And if you can see here, it's no more showing the green sign, which is running. Okay. So you can see it's exited. Now, what do we do next? The next thing we want to do is that we want to run Elasticsearch. Okay. Now, Elasticsearch runs on port 9200 and it integrates with SSL. So when you try to access the local host for for Elasticsearch, you will not be using the common HTTP localhost and the port number to access it. You have to use HTTPS. Okay. That's just another insight we want to share with you. So what do? We say Docker. Okay. We say run. Once again, detached as a separate entity, -- name or hyphen. Then we say Elastic. Okay. Search space port number 920 to run on 920. Then we say -E. Now we want this to be discovered as a single node of its own existence. We can say, okay, discovery dot type should be equals to what? A single node. Okay. Hyphen node. Then we say Docker, the official link to pull it from elastic.co /Elasticsearch /. Remember again, we want to run a specific version that corresponds with the version of Kibana we're running. Or should we say we have, spawn on our container. So we can say Elasticsearch, then the version number 8.9.0, and we hit enter. Now you can see it also tells us that ELK, Elasticsearch, I keep saying ELK, Elasticsearch and Kibana. Elasticsearch is not found on our machine locally and it's trying to pull this container. Now be mindful, once this is installed, it's going to spawn Elasticsearch. Once again, we have to stop Elasticsearch from running. Now you might be asking why. It's simple. During this installation, Kibana will create its own network settings. Elasticsearch is going to create its own network settings as a different entity because we install this as a detached node, right? But we need to integrate both to run as a team because both has to work together for we to be able to, use this Kibana application efficiently to perform whatever related content we want to perform as a SOC analyst. Okay. So once this pulling is complete, we have to stop Elasticsearch just the same way we stopped Kibana previously. And after we're done, we are now going to merge the network settings. If it's not created, we have to create it. Then after merging, we have to now start Elasticsearch and Kibana. Then, of course, run some WSL command, which is Windows subsystem for Linux, to spawn Linux-based terminal on our Windows machine to get some tokens and password generated. And of course, properly set up Kibana together with Elasticsearch. Okay, so don't worry. Just like we've been running this here, it's an easy step. It's an easy process. We have gone through the rigorous step of troubleshooting and getting this done. And the process here is very simple for you. One more thing, which is the downside of learning this, is that you have to have a computer system that has at least 64 GB. Okay, the role of a SOC analyst is quite complex, and a lot of tools are going to be getting involved in this training. If you don't have, just try and save, or try and get a menial job or something for the time being. Nothing good comes easy. You mustn't become successful in a day, but try and get a simple job for you to be able to get a very sophisticated computer, at least 64 GB RAM, to be able to use for your SOC analyst related training. Now, as you can see, Elasticsearch is running. You can see on the icon here, it's running, right? Once again, how do we know? We can say Docker PS. And as you can see, Elasticsearch here, which is the name, is running, right? Now, the same routine, we have to stop it. So we say Docker stop Elasticsearch. Yeah, now you can see it has stopped, and you can see it's no more green here. We can say Docker PS again. And you can see we don't have any container running, right? Now, what do we want to do next? By right, once we install these various containers of Kibana and Elasticsearch, their network settings will be created. But it's okay if there are cases whereby there are no network settings created. It's very simple. What do? We just say Docker create. Okay, sorry, I made a mistake. Docker network create. Okay, then we say Elastic network. Now, by right, it should be created already, but if you see it's not created, it will create it. And you can see error response from daemon. Network with this name Elastic network already exists. That's a good thing. Now we know that this network settings has been created. The next thing we have to do is very simple. Now we have to connect the Elasticsearch to the Elastic network. Now, once that is done, we can now link the Kibana network and the Elasticsearch network together before starting Kibana and Elasticsearch. So how do we do this? It's very simple. We say Docker network connect Elastic network Elasticsearch. Good. Now Elasticsearch is connected to its network, right? Now it's connected. The next thing we want to do is that we want to connect Kibana to Elastic network as well. So what do we do next? It's very simple. We'll say Docker network connect Elastic network Kibana. Hit, and we hit enter. Now it's connected. Now we're almost there. The next thing we have to do now is that we start Elasticsearch first before starting Kibana, because Kibana requires Elasticsearch to be able to run efficiently and of course configure everything necessary. So what do? It's very simple. We say Docker start Elasticsearch, which is this container. This is the container name. Okay. So if you don't know why we're saying Elasticsearch, it's just this name here, and we hit enter. Here you can see it's green. It has started, right? Then we move on to say Docker start Kibana. And as you can see, it's consuming a lot of RAMs, right? This is why you need a high, CPU RAM. Now we have launched Kibana and Elasticsearch. Let's now go ahead and access this link, localhost. And you can see for Kibana also for Elasticsearch is on port 9200, and for Kibana is on this. Okay. Now we go here. Yeah, you guys need to give us subscribing. Okay. We are 375. help us to get to 1,000 before the year runs out. Okay, thank you. So we go back here. We say HTTP host on port 501. Okay, so we go back again and see why. Okay, so it's running, right? Let's try again. Great. So sometimes you have to give it, a little bit of time for the whole thing to initialize. Okay. If you don't give it a little bit of time, you might have situations whereby you might think it's not working. Okay. So just, this, it doesn't mean it's not working. Whenever you face that error, just hold on and make sure that you're patient. Okay. For it to run. Now, the next thing we want to do is very simple. We want to now access Elasticsearch. Okay. Remember, we said you have to access Elasticsearch via HTTPS, not HTTP localhost. Localhost and colon 9200. Now you will get this. Okay. This connection is not private and so on. Never mind. Just say, help me understand. You say proceed and save. Now, once you click on proceed, on save, it's going to ask you for username and password. Now, this is the interesting part. The username for this login is Elastic. Now, to generate the password, we have to spawn the WSL terminal, to get the Elasticsearch password. And of course, we also have to spawn the WSL for Kibana to get the activation code. Okay, this is a very, very straightforward step. Follow this step attentively so that you don't miss out anything. So the next thing we want to do is very simple. We can open a new terminal. Okay, it's always advisable to do this. CD to C, ELK. Remember, all the commands will be run from this, directory where the Kibana and Elasticsearch is running. Okay, so what do we do is that we want to execute Elasticsearch as a bash. Okay, so to do this, we say docker exec -8 Elasticsearch as a bash. Okay, good. Now if we see this CLS, right, you can see not found. Okay, good. Now what do we do next is that we need to go to the bin directory. That's where the password will be generated and the activation token and so on. Okay, so what do we do is very simple. We say cd to bin. Now we're in the bin directory, right? Now we want to generate Elasticsearch enrollment token. This. Okay, we need the enrollment token. But before we generate the enrollment token, we have to get the password to log in. Okay, because once we put the enrollment token in Elasticsearch, it's going to try to link to the sign on here to ensure that everything works very well. Okay, so that's why we first of all we generate the password, we log in and ensure that we have gotten a successful login before we proceed to generate the token. So how do we now generate a password for this? It's very simple. Again, we come here. Remember, in the bin directory, we say .root, okay, Elasticsearch reset, okay, password minus username. Now Elastic. Okay, so we are trying to reset the password to generate a new password for the username Elastic. So this is the username we are going to use. We can add any other name here. You can use FIXITGEARWARE-SECURITY, but it's better you just follow this process. Okay, and we hit enter. Then you say yes. Why? Good. Now you can see the new value of the password is this, right? We just copy this. Very simple. Then we go back here and we log in. We put the password here. Remember, okay, we need to log in first. Now we sign in. Now, if everything works fine, you should see a JSON information here, like this. Okay, you should see something like this. Can tell you the build hash, the version, and all that you're running. Okay, make sure you see this when you log in. If not, then it's not working fine. You go through the entire steps which we have just done to ensure you follow the right procedures to getting this executed on your machine. So now we have logged in successfully. The next thing we want to do is to generate this activation token so we can configure Elasticsearch. Okay, now don't configure manually. It's dangerous. If you configure manually, it's not going to connect. We need to do it via a token. So what do? We go back again. Okay, this time around we run this command to generate the token still for Elasticsearch. So how do we generate the token? We say root Elasticsearch. Okay, create enrollment. Okay, we say token. Then we give hyphen scope. We want to specify the scope to be what? Kibana, since we are going to be using Kibana. Okay, and we hit enter. Now it's telling us no such files on this. Okay, Elasticsearch create enrollment token. Okay, now there's a mistake. You can see we spelled enrollment wrongly. So we go back again. It's a double L there. And we hit enter. Good. So be very careful. We always make this type of mistakes, okay? So now we've gotten the enrollment token via Elasticsearch. The next thing we do is very simple. We copy this right. Now we go to Kibana, which is here. We paste the enrollment token. Now we click on configure Elastic. See what's going to happen. Now it will be asking you for Kibana verification code. Okay, this is where we go back again and spawn the WSL for Kibana. Okay, previously we spawned the WSL for Elasticsearch, but now we have to spawn the WSL for Kibana. So what do? It's very simple. We go back here again. We open a new terminal. Remember, procedures matters. We cd to C. Okay, ELK, and remember always from the directory where those containers were installed. So Kibana and Elasticsearch was installed in directory ELK. Okay, then we come here. Remember what we did previously. We did for Elasticsearch to start the WSL. Now for this Kibana section, we also have to repeat the same process. So what do? We say docker exec it. We say Kibana, and of course we want it to be a bash terminal. Sorry, not bash. And we hit enter. Now we cd to bin. Now what we want to do from here is that we want to get the activation code. So this activation code is what we are going to use to set up Elasticsearch on Kibana. Okay, so how do we get the activation code or verification code? It's very simple. You just say root Kibana verification code. Now we have this code, which is 206 and 465. Very simple. We go back here again. 206 465, and we click verify. Now, if everything works fine, you should be seeing saving settings, starting Elastic, and completing setup. Now, this completing setup would take at least about 30 to 40 minutes. Okay, because quite a lot of files has to be pulled in and installed. Okay, So we don't want to waste time to spend on you to see this entirely set up. But if everything works fine, if you follow through this entire steps or process which we have just run, you should be able to get this successfully started, and of course execute some other stuff you want to do with Kibana. Okay. So if everything works fine, this is what you're going to see. You can see the successful completion of the whole process. And remember, for this login, you're still going to use the same username Elastic and the password which we generated previously to, log in to Elastic, because we are trying to use Elastic on Kibana. So means the credential for Elastic is what we are going to use to log in on Kibana. Very simple, straightforward, not complicated. Once you log in, you should see something like this. You can decide to add your own integrations or explore on my own. So we have not yet added integrations, which we'll be doing on our next training or our subsequent training. So we decided to click the explore my own options or explore on my own for you to, see how it looks like on the dashboard. And of course, this is other things you can see. You can decide to also click on display a different page on login. That will also explain subsequently on our continuous training on how to use Kibana and so on. And of course, once it's running, you can access Kibana from any browser on your system. As you can see, we try to access it on another browser, and you can see that we still got the login page. And of course, you have to use the same username Elastic and the new password which we generated during the entire process for logging into Elastic. So here is a summary of the storage usage. As you can see the size of the RAM by using over 18 gigabytes on our previous installation. Okay, so just know much about these informations, because you actually need a good healthy system with enough RAM to be able to run this container of Kibana and Elasticsearch. Okay, so that will be all for this week. Training on the installation of Elasticsearch and Kibana. Expect more from us when it comes to blue teaming stuff. Like we said, you're going to learn about SOC, a lot of blue teaming stuff, both free and paid content of courses, which we are going to show you. And we promise that these are going to be well-detailed content. So don't worry if you wonder you're going to be paying a lot of money for that. Yes, of course, you'll have to pay. And the payment is not basically out of, to make money from you. Is to give you a standard knowledge well enough to secure a job. Okay. Our training method is going to be a training method that gives you an in-depth insight on hands-on. So even if you don't have work experience, whatever we teach you can serve as work experience, because we're teaching you based on the concept we know and have, not based on something, like running a lab. You don't even know what you're doing, don't even know what commands you're running, just like this free training today. You just do things and you don't even know why they are working or why you are running those things. Okay. So be rest assured that our paid courses, no matter how expensive it is, will be worth your, the price which you're going to pay for it. Okay. So once again, thanks for watching these videos. For those who are subscribing to our channel, we're very grateful. Please share with your friends. Don't be stingy. Informations are good to be shared. Okay. And share, because once you share, we are excited to do more. And by doing more, we mean real life situations that are not even related to labs. Okay. If you read our blog post, you can see how we write our content on like the few Hack the Box lab. I think 1 or 2, which we have just published. We have a lot to publish, but there's not much time and we have limited resources. But rest assured, we are going to publish them. So you can see the way, once again, how we write our stuff. They sound, like steps. Okay. It's like a baby step guidance. So whenever you're reading content, you're not reading like you're in Disney. You're reading the practical aspect and approach and why certain things were done and why we thought this way or why we should think this way whenever we're performing any actions. Okay. So once again, thank you. Please share with your friends, subscribe, help us get to 1,000 before the end of the year in terms of subscribers. That would be a good thing for us to celebrate. Okay. And of course, hopefully, if we're rich, we can do a few giveaways to celebrate our 1,000 subscribers. Okay. So thanks for watching. This video might be long and boring, but trust me, it's a boring content that is well packed with knowledge. See you until next time. Bye for now.